Good morning again, guys. So I almost did not remember that on my schedule I had written that I was going to be reading this book this morning. I was going to continue the reading of this book this morning. So when I got off the live just now, off the Bible live, I thought, oh well, boom, I'm heading out right now. And then I picked up my schedule, looked on it on my phone, and I was like, oh, okay. I did schedule that I was going to read the book Grace Under Fire this morning. So before I run out and do all else that I have to do, I must fulfill this obligation. So come on over with me, guys, and let us read the book Grace Under Fire. We are now at chapter 32. We are very close to finishing. We haven't read it in a few days, but we are going to read it now. All right. We have seen where Isabel and Michael are in Scotland. They are meeting with several different people. Some of these people that they are meeting with, though, I am not too keen on their trust, their trustworthiness. Um, I don't know. Michael is very intuitive, way more so than Isabel. And so I trust Michael's judgment that he will keep them safe. But Isabel, Isabel is a little bit can be a little hard headed, and she has the right person by her side to ensure that she stays safe and follows the rules. But I guess the greatest concern right now is what they're going to do about Clive Arcus, who has taken up possession of the property that Isabel has inherited from her uncle. But they haven't met him yet, but we will see in this chapter what happens. So come along with me, guys, and let us read the book Grace Under Fire, chapter 32. Terror certainly was a fit description of the man who was standing at the door, surveying the pub's crowd as though he were hunting for prey. With fire in his eyes, the ugly brute then headed to the bar. That's Clive Arcus. Fletcher whispered his name and hunched down until his forehead was almost touching the tabletop. Grammy Gibson is with him. They are both mean and rabid as dogs. They are both as mean as rabid dogs. Oh my God. Isabel didn't think she had ever seen anyone this angry. Arcus's body was rigid and his clenched fist shook with his fury. He was a big man, about Michael's size, but the comparison stopped there. Clive had more flab than muscle through his middle, but his shoulders and beefy arms were those of a weightlifter. He had a double chin and a thick neck that all but disappeared in his sloped shoulders. The hateful expression on his face could give children nightmares, their parents too. He looked exactly like what he was, a bully, and he was out for blood. Grammy trailed behind him. The look on his face jarred her, as though he might start laughing at any moment. His expression wavered between a smirk and a smile, and how creepy was that? Was he eager for the blow-up he knew was coming? An older woman called out to Clive as she entered the pub behind them. She looked worried. Mr. Fletcher, do you know who that woman is? Isabel's voice trailed off when she realized he was gone. Michael explained before she could ask. He flew out the back door. I was about to look under the table, she said as she turned around and saw no sign of the man. I guess Mr. Fletcher does not want Arcus to recognize him. Everybody is so scared of this man. Annie rushed over to their booth. You should get out of here, she said. It isn't safe. Go out the back way, she whispered, and be careful. They are here for you. You don't need to worry about me. I'm with him, she said, nudging Michael. He won't let anyone get to me. Tell me, Annie, who is the woman pleading with Clive Arcus? Freya is her name, she answered. Poor thing, she looks like she's going to cry. She is Clive's mother, and that's reason enough to weep, I suppose. Now go, both of you, she begged before she hurried away. The crowded pub was rapidly emptying. Customers couldn't seem to get out of there fast enough. One man tripped on the steps, and another man, clearly inebriated, fell on top of him. The two were a sight, staggering to their feet and helping each other out the door. Clive was arguing with his mother, who was clinging to him. He pulled her along to a table in the corner and all but pushed her into a chair. Hi, Shazib, how you doing, my love? Good to see you. Stay here, his mother called out. Try to stay calm. The woman looked so anxious. Who could blame her? Her son, after all, was a monster. Did Freya realize it, or did she wear blinders? Isabel noticed the paper in Clive's hand. Then. Uh-oh, she whispered. The paper Clive is waving around is the eviction notice, isn't it? It would seem so, Michael said. Gladstone did say he would have both letters delivered by the end of the day. Graeme was also holding a paper. His termination letter, no doubt. He obviously wasn't upset about it because he was grinning. What was that about? These people are crazy, Isabel decided, and violent, she added, when Clive started shoving chairs out of his way to cross over to Isabel and Michael's booth. I'm nervous for them, guys. I don't know about you. Sinclair intercepted him in the middle of the pub with an obstacle suddenly standing in front of him. Clive got into Sinclair's face and began shouting at him. Isabel was impressed by the inspector's calm demeanor. Does Clive think Sinclair wrote the eviction letter? Michael shook his head. From the look in his eyes, I don't believe he's thinking at all. His anger is controlling him. Get out of my way, Clive shouted at Sinclair. Unfazed by the madman screeching at him, the inspector held his ground. Twice Clive tried to get around him, but each time he was blocked. I told you to get out of my effing way, Clive shouted again. You can't stop me from getting to her. Now move. I'm not going to tell you again. Sinclair drew Michael and Isabel's attention when he looked in their direction and tilted his head ever so slightly towards the back door. The bartender reached for a phone on the shelf behind him and ducked behind the counter and undoubtedly calling for backup. The inspector is giving us a nod. He wants us to leave, doesn't he? Isabel asked. Not really wanting an answer, she rushed on. No, 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 I'm not going to run away. I want to stand up to Clive and let him know he can't bully me. Michael wasn't going to argue with her. He had liked nothing better than to knock the smug look off Clive Harcus's face, but Isabel's safety came first. He was determined to get her out of harm's way, and if that meant throwing her over his shoulder and going out the back door, then that's what he was prepared to do. Sinclair can handle himself, Michael said, and he's in uniform. Clive wouldn't dare touch him. He's not that stupid. Apparently he was. The plan to get Isabel out of the pub changed when Clive shoved Sinclair, knocked him clear off his feet. The back of Sinclair's head struck the edge of the table as he fell to the floor. Stay in the booth, Isabel. Michael moved fast. 1 second he was sitting beside her, and the next he was nose to nose with Clive Harcus. Clive would have to go through him to get to her or Sinclair. Both fists raised to strike. Clive lunged, but he was no match for Michael's speed and agility. He blocked Clive's left arm with one hand and slammed his fist into Clive's face with the other. Clive howled as he went flying down and back, landing on his backside. Blood spurted from his nose, and Isabel was certain Michael had broken it. She found herself hoping he had. Oh, AG, come back. AG, AG, how are you doing? AG, me nearly forget some. I had planned to read this book this morning, and I finished reading the Bible and decided, book, me I go run out because I have some things to do. Then I opened the phone and look at my schedule. And I said, Kuya, our plan was to read the book this morning, so I can't run out and read it. Bless up yourself, Joseph. You're wild. You sleep in the bed. Oh, Joseph. I just crash on the couch, see that's my thing. I just crash on the couch from one couch to the next. Oh my word. But welcome, guys. Thank you all so much for coming back. You know me always. I can always depend on you guys for the love and support, and I sincerely appreciate it. Let us continue. She found herself hoping he had. Isabel heard Freya cry out. Clive's sidekick. Clive's sidekick, Gremme, got up from the table where he had been sitting with Freya and headed towards Michael. Seeing him coming, Michael shook his head and said, You'll want to sit down. There was something in his voice that got through to Gremme because he hightailed it back to Freya. Both Sinclair and Clive staggered to their feet. Sinclair rubbed the back of his head, and when he saw the blood on his hand, muttered something Isabel couldn't hear. Put him in a chair, he told Michael. Clive wiped his nose with the back of his hand, smearing blood all over his face. I don't have to sit down, he muttered, and I'm going to sue you, you bastard. You broke my nose. Sit down, Sinclair snapped. Clive acted as though he was going to cooperate. He turned to pull the chair close, then spun around with clenched fist and tried to punch Michael again. Poor Clive. You're a slow learner, Michael remarked as he twisted Clive's arm back and shoved him into the chair. Clive squinted up at Michael. I'm not going to forget what you just did, Buchanan. I'd watch my back if I were you. Michael didn't seem surprised that Clive knew who he was. By now, Sinclair was standing next to Michael, staring at Clive. You put your hands on an officer of the law. Clive shrugged. I just gave you a little nudge to get you out of my way. Are you going to arrest me for that? He scoffed. Yes, I am, Sinclair answered. Clive grabbed a couple of napkins from the table and wiped his face again. Then he tossed them back on the table. He leaned he leaned around Michael to look at Isabel. His face was turning red with fury again. While he stared at her, he slowly tore up the eviction letter. I'm not going to let you steal what belongs to me, he bellowed. If I have to, he began, then suddenly stopped. If you have to, you'll what? Michael demanded, pressing in on him. Clive shook his head, refusing to answer. Miss McKenna signed the papers and is now the sole owner of Glen McKenna. If you have a problem with that, take it to the courts. In the meantime, leave her alone. Two police officers rushed into the pub. One of them pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Sinclair took him aside and gave him instructions while Michael stood over Clive. Twice he tried to get up, and twice Michael shoved him back into the chair. Annie handed Sinclair a wet cloth, and he used it to wipe blood seeping from the cut on the back of his head. She took the long way around Clive to get to the kitchen and grab a carry-out plastic bag Michael had asked her for. Powerless to intervene, Freya had remained in her chair, looking frightened and distressed by what had just happened to her son. When the officers began to put handcuffs on him, she jumped to her feet. He didn't do anything wrong. Please don't arrest him, she begged. She pointed at Michael. That man assaulted him. That man assaulted my son. Her pleas were ignored. It took both officers to get Clive's hand behind his back and snap the cuffs on. You won't be able to help me lock up to keep me locked up for long, he said. I'll be out by tomorrow night, Clive boasted. As he was being dragged out of the pub, he pulled away from the officers long enough to say goodbye to his mother. He told her to get him a solicitor and be damn quick about it. Who should I call, Clive? Tell me who to call, she pleaded. The door closed before Clive could respond. Gremme answered her. I'll find someone better than McCarthy. Don't you worry. He paused to glare at Isabel and added in a shout, You aren't going to get away with this atrocity, you bastard. I'm going to make sure you can't cause any trouble around here. Now, this is Gremme, the groundskeeper, talking to Isabel. He is angry because him being the groundskeeper for the property meant that he lived there. Now, If he's being evicted, he's going to have to find some places to live and another job. He's not happy about that. Shoving his chair back, Grimace stood and said to Freya, "The car is several roads over. I'll go get it and pull it up to the door. Stay here until I come back inside for you." With the pub quiet now, Annie returned and gave Michael the bag. He opened it and used it to scoop up the bloody napkin Clive had used and tossed on the table. He sealed the bag and handed it to Sinclair. Isabel's attention went to Clive's mother. Freya held a lacy handkerchief up to her eyes, dabbing the tears away. Now she was crying for her son, Clive. No matter what, guys, a mother always loves her child, no matter what. And even if that child is a devil, he can still be assured his mother's love. Isabel couldn't imagine the distress she would feel watching someone she loved being handcuffed and taken away. She had an insane urge to go over to the woman and apologize, which didn't make a lick of sense, she knew. She wasn't going to do it, but she knew being Clive's mother had to be hell for her. Approaching Freya would probably upset her even more. Besides, Michael would probably tackle her if she took one step in that woman's direction. She slid out of the booth with the intention of going to Michael, who was in a quiet discussion with Sinclair, but then she saw Freya stand and made her way over to her. They met a few feet from each other with a round table between them. Isabel pulled out a chair and sat. Freya nodded to her and sat down across from her. Neither one said a word for a minute while they studied each other. Freya was a surprise to Isabel. She wasn't at all what she had pictured. Her erect posture gave her an almost regal bearing. Isabel couldn't tell how old she was. Her dark hair was pulled back. The only hints of her true age were the few silver strands in her hair and the fine lines around her eyes. She was slender and dressed in a black sweater and slacks. Her simple attire was not matched by her accessories, though. The woman obviously had a fancy for jewelry. Large silver teardrops hung from her ears, several strands of beads circled her neck, and at least a half a dozen bangles surrounded her wrists. When she folded her manicured hands on the table, the bracelets made a clanging sound. Freya spoke first. "Life hasn't been fair to my son. He's trying to get better control, but he has lapses, especially when someone has wronged him. He has his father's temper." Then, as though stating the obvious, she said, "Compton McKenna was Clive's father. I was in love with him, you know." "No, I didn't know that. It was so many years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday." Freya began with a wistful sigh. "Compton came down to Donruss to make arrangements for Glenn McKenna. I was working as a waitress." She raised her hand to gesture around the pub. "Here at Jolly Jack's, actually. I met Compton the first night he arrived. We took to each other right away. I guess you could say it was love at first sight. I knew he loved me. He told me so, so many times. We were together almost every minute that he was here. He made promises to me, and then he left. He just left me." She stopped for a second, shaking her head as though the insult was still fresh in her mind. "No warning at all. He made me look like a fool, and I was devastated by his betrayal. When I found out I was pregnant, I tried to get a hold of him. I expected him to do the right thing." "What was the right thing?" Isabel asked. "Marriage," she answered. "I expected him to marry me." If Freya really believed that Compton would marry her, she hadn't known him well at all, Isabel thought. He was all about titles and blue bloods. Freya was what Compton would have called common. "Did you ever talk to him?" "No," Freya answered. "I must have called him 50 times. He would never talk to me. I did speak to one of his assistants, who told me to stop harassing Compton, or there would be unpleasant consequences. I told the assistant that I was pregnant, but I didn't know if he ever told Compton. I guess I always expected him to return to Scotland especially since he loved Glen McKenna so much. But he never did. I was all alone with the child, his child. That must have been very difficult for you, Isabel said sympathetically. It was terrible. I didn't know where to turn. I had to support us both. Then, when Clive was 3, I met Malcolm Harcus. He married me, and Clive took his name. But the marriage only lasted a couple of years, and he left us. I raised that boy on my own without any financial help. It was especially hard on Clive. So surely you can understand what it was like for him to be abandoned twice. That would make you very angry, wouldn't it? I never lied to him. From the time he was very young, he knew who his real father was. Over the years, we would hear bits and pieces about Compton, and we knew he never married or had children. Clive was sure that Glen McKenna would be his someday. So you can see why he would want to oversee the management of the land in the meantime. Compton had left James Gibson in charge as Glen McKenna's caretaker. When James died, his son Grammy took over. He has been Clive's right-hand man for the last few years. I'm telling you all of this, so you realize that your claim to this land is groundless. Just because there's a piece of paper that says it's yours doesn't make it so. She raised her voice defiantly then. Glen McKenna belongs to him. What will you do with this land anyway? Go back to America and forget all about it? Isabel could see how distraught the woman was, so now was not the time to tell her that her son may well be going to prison for his role in attempted murder. It was obvious she was protective of him and would be defensive. Isabel would let any accusation come from the police. She tried to sound understanding when she said, "I'm sorry for all that you have got going on. I truly am. But that doesn't change the legality of Compton's will. It's final. I've signed the papers and I own Glen McKenna now." "So my son is being cheated out of his inheritance?" Freda said, as though the very thought was incomprehensible to her. She then straightened in her chair and looked straight into Isabel's eyes. "I suppose Clive may have to take you to court then to get what is rightfully what is rightfully his. Even if that happened, he can't ever sell it. Compton's will is specific, and it's obvious that Clive's only interest in the land is the profit he would make by selling it to developers. Why would you keep what doesn't belong to you, you selfish bitch?" Freya hissed in a whisper. "Selfish? I don't agree," Isabel said quietly, hoping her tone would calm the woman. "The Patterson Group, James Reed, and your son have big plans for the land. Simply put, they would destroy it. I'm making sure they can't." Grammy interrupted. He called out to Freya and waited for her at the top of the steps. Freya stood, but kept her attention on Isabel. "Is it done? Have you already signed the papers?" "Yes." Freya didn't say goodbye. She put her purse over her arm and walked out of the pub with her head held high. Isabel watched her leave. She didn't feel guilty. She was thinking about future generations. She believed it was her duty to protect the beauty of God's gift. The glorious highlands belonged to the people, and whatever she could do to preserve the land, she would do. It came to her in an instant. She had an answer. She immediately turned her phone on and called Donald Gladstone to tell him what she wanted to do. He was so excited by her proposal, he promised to do everything in his power to make it happen. Michael had kept his eye on Isabel while he had been talking to Sinclair. She walked over to join them. "How are you feeling, Inspector?" she asked. "I'm fine," he assured her. Isabel isn't on looking at the injury. Isabel insisted on looking on the injury. "It's not bleeding anymore, but you might need stitches." "Are you ready to leave?" Michael asked. "In just a minute." She hurried over to the bartender and asked him to put some ice in a plastic bag. Does the pub always clear out when Clever Harcus comes in? She asked him. Pretty much, he said. He's bad for business. The locals are afraid of him, and for good reason. He's quite a bully. Word will spread that is locked up, and there will be a crowd here tomorrow night. Isabel thanked him for the ice bag and handed it to Sinclair. This will help reduce the swelling. Once again, the inspector assured her that he was fine, but from the way he was smiling at Isabel, Michael could tell he was appreciative of her concern. He shook Michael's hand. I'll talk to you soon, he promised. Isabel was suddenly in a hurry to get back to the hotel. After the brief interaction with Clive Harcus, she felt the need for a hot shower. I guess because she was probably tired, she was exhausted, she was probably sweaty. She needed a hot shower for real. Michael was more relaxed now that Arcus was locked up, and yet he wasn't ready to let his guard down. Admittedly, he wasn't as desperate to get her on a plane back to Boston, though. Tomorrow, they had another meeting with Gladstone, who had told Isabel he would have preliminary papers ready to go over. The meeting was set for 4 p.m. An hour after the scene at the pub, Isabel was ready for bed, but she couldn't unwind. She was too revved up to sleep just yet. She thought about turning on her phone to check her emails and texts, but she couldn't make herself do it. She hated answering emails and texts almost as much as she hated talking on the phone. Realizing just how much she disliked the interruption actually made her smile. In high in high school, her cell phone had been attached to her ear. It was the first thing she grabbed in the morning and the last thing she put down every night. But by the end of her college days, she had developed a real dislike for the interruption of answering a call. She had certainly changed over the years. You look happy. What were you thinking? Michael asked. He had just finished his shower and his hair was wet. She watched him turn off the lights, but his bed put out his bedside lamp and stretched out on the bed next to her, stacked his hands on his chest and closed his eyes. I was thinking about phones. I realized that, except for a quick call tonight, I haven't turned my cell phone on for days. I put it in my charger every night, and every morning I put it in my purse, but I don't turn it on. It's been pleasant. You know that is true, guys. For those of you who are attached to your phones, as we all are, I am attached to my phones. But a few days ago, a few weeks back, I ran out of the house to go to work, and I didn't have my phone. And I tell you, my friends, it felt weird that I didn't have my phone the whole evening, the whole night at work. I didn't have my phone. It felt really odd. And I was like, wow, this is how we lived 20, 25 years ago. We did not have these phones attached to our hands 24/7. And we went out and we went about our business and we got things done. And here I was without my phone, feeling odd. But I felt like I could do so much more without glancing at the phone at every text or every email all the time. And I just thought, every now and again, I should go without my phone. But then I thought about it in this day and age, that's going to be a no. Because we need our phones to capture moments. We need our phones to capture evidences. We need our phones because that's the way people can get in touch with us and we can get in touch with others. So our phones have become actually part of us. Our phones have become a part of us. We are not doing anything without our phones. And it's very odd these days when you see somebody and they don't have a phone. Like what? What? You don't have a phone? Not even one of the Obama phones? Yeah. Oh. So here it is too with Isabel. Isabel is saying how pleasant it is to have not been on her phone for the last few days. Let us continue. Let us continue. Isabel says it's been pleasant for her not to have had her phone. I don't want you to turn it on because they could track us. But now that everyone knows we're here, it doesn't really matter now. I haven't missed it. That's nice, Michael said on a yawn. She knew he would be asleep in seconds. She wished she could do the same. She saw a side of Michael tonight that shocked and surprised her. She had never seen anyone move as fast. The way he fought and controlled Clive was impressive. She knew he was strong, but seeing him in action was jaw-dropping. His Navy SEAL training came out in full force. He made it look so easy. He was almost nonchalant about it. In fact, he probably didn't think it over much. Isabel wasn't an advocate of ever using violence, but the image of Michael punching Clive was quite gratifying. If anyone needed a good punch, it was Clive Harcus. Damn it, Michael muttered, opening his eyes and rolling towards her. What's wrong? I forgot your birthday. I'm sorry. Guess it was pretty awful. We'll have to celebrate later. Awful? It wasn't awful. Then what was it? Once again, she pictured Michael's fist connecting with Clive's ugly face. Best birthday ever. He rolled her into his arms. Yeah? It's about to get even better. I guess it was. I guess it got even better with Isabel and Michael probably humping each other. OMG, guys, that is the end of chapter 32 of the book Grace Under Fire, written by Julie Garwood. And we are going to continue reading. Let us read chapter 33. All right. Isabel could never tell anyone that what Michael gave her for her birthday. I bet she can't. To say his gift was X rated was an understatement. She didn't wake up until 9. She sat up in bed, her hair hanging in her face. She brushed it over her shoulder and found Michael across the room. He was working on his laptop. He didn't look up. Good morning. He was dressed and ready to go. How long have you been up? She asked. Her voice was as croaky as a frog's. A couple of hours. Get moving, he said. Yes, yes, all right. She continued to sit there, staring off in space. Isabel closed her eyes, and after a minute or two, Michael realized she had gone back to sleep, sitting up no less. His laughter startled her. She wanted to curl up and go back to sleep for a couple of hours, but she knew she couldn't. With a groan, she slid out of bed and went to the bathroom. After dressing, she returned to the bedroom to find Michael sitting still on his laptop. She watched him reading the screen for several minutes and then said, I thought you were in a hurry to leave. I was just checking our route to Inverness. I booked our flight to Boston and we need to be at the airport by 5 tomorrow. Tomorrow? You want to fly back to Boston tomorrow? She hadn't expected his abrupt announcement. Couldn't we stay an extra day or two? I like it here. There's so much to see. No, no. The refusal came a little too quickly. I know you want to get back to your life, she began. Yes, I do. His curt response made her angry, but she was determined to stay calm, and yelling wouldn't accomplish anything. She began to straighten the room just to have something to do while she worked on getting her emotions under control. What are you doing? He asked. What does it look like I'm doing? I'm making the bed. The maids will strip the sheets, he said. I know. She didn't say another word until she had finished the task. Okay. Her temper was under control and her breathing was normal again. Now that Clive Arcus is locked up, there isn't any reason to be worried about my safety. You go ahead and fly home. I'm going to stay here a little while longer. Michael tried to be reasonable. What about all of Clive's friends? You think they won't come after you? Before she could think of a logical answer, he said, a lot of people don't want you to ruin their plans for Glen McKenna. And aside from that obvious threat, there's also the fact that you are a celebrity. What does that matter? You don't remember what it is like getting out of the arena in Boston? Oh, yes, she remembered. It would have been terrifying if Michael hadn't been there with her. Not at all many people know who I am, she argued. You are wrong. They know who you are. They just haven't been able to find out where you are. And that's because of all the help we have gotten from Nick and Alec and Noah with the cars and the hotels. I can handle a crowd. It was a blatant lie, but she thought she told it well. Exasperated, he said, they'd run right over you. I'm not going back to Boston without you. Do you understand me? It isn't safe for you here. You are going home with me. He walked over to her, tilted her chin up so she could look at him, and softened his tone. Do you honestly believe I would leave you here? You didn't. He didn't give her time to answer. He leaned down and kissed her. When he pulled away, she looked a little dazed. Come on, he said. Let's get out of here. We'll stop at the front desk and let them know we'll be staying one more night. She grabbed her rain jacket, shoved her wallet into a pocket, and zipped it closed, put her cell phone in her pants pocket, and followed him out the door. It was a beautiful day. The sun was out, but Isabel knew rain clouds could sneak in at any time. The weather was fickle in the highlands, but hot, cold, wet, dry, it didn't matter to her. She still loved it. I've read books about this country and I've seen hundreds of photos, but nothing compares to actually being here. She was leading up she was leading up to making him understand why she wanted to stay. He cut her off though. Then we'll come back. She was surprised that he had included himself. It would be nice to roam around without people trying to kill me. He laughed. Yeah, I guess that would be nice. On their way to Donruss, they talked about the FBI and Michael's decision to enter the academy. The academy. You'll start the end of August. Yes. Will the training to become an agent be as brutal and intense as it was for you to become a Navy SEAL? No. She waited for him to tell her more, and when he remained silent, she asked, care to explain why it won't be as difficult? No. Michael, do you know what people's skills are? Yes, I do. You ought to get some. He just shrugged and smiled. It wasn't the reaction she wanted. What are you going to do when you get back to Boston? He asked a few minutes later. Spend the night, then fly back to South Carolina. I suppose. I honestly don't know where I'll end up. I can work on my songs anywhere, she added. Odd though it was, thinking about leaving the Highlands made her emotional. Probably because she was trying not to admit leaving Scotland meant leaving Michael too. He had his future all mapped out, and it didn't include her. We have a lot of time. Do you want to drive around Glen McKenna? We have only we have only seen a tip of it. I'd like that. Only when they had taken the tour of her land did she realize just how big it was. It had everything a national park envied. There were streams and lakes, hills and valleys, all places to fish, hunt, and hike. For an outdoors man, Glen McKenna was utopia. They had circled around to Rosemont when Sinclair called. Michael put him on speaker. The inspector sounded ecstatic with his news. They were beginning the investigation to connect Harcus to the kill order given to Jacoby and Ferris. But in the meantime, the investigators going through McCarthy's records have found proof that Harcus had received large sums of money to do McCarthy's dirty work, including framing Willie Croft for stealing government funds, the case Sinclair had mentioned earlier. They had enough hard evidence to put Clive Harcus in prison for at least 20 years. There wouldn't be any talk of bail. The terror of the Highlands was finished. There was also evidence implicating Gremmer Gibson, and Sinclair was on his way to Gremmer's cottage to arrest him. Michael finished the call and parked in front of a little cafe down the street from the Rosemore police station. We have plenty of time to grab something to eat before we head over to Donruss for your meeting with Gladstone. Another call came in for Michael. This one was his brother Nick, and while he talked to him, Isabel decided to turn her cell phone on and find out how many calls she had missed and how many texts she needed to read. The number, the number made her groan. She would take the time to go through them all later. She turned the ringer to vibrate and dropped the phone back in her pocket. Her stomach was growling. As soon as she had mentioned food, she became hungry. The power of suggestion. The cafe was small, but they were the only customers. They sat by the front window so that Michael could watch the street. While they ate, she told Michael what Freya had said to her. I can't imagine why she would believe Compton would marry her. She told him, I'm surprised she would talk to you. She was almost pleasant until I mentioned that I owned the property now. Almost pleasant? No, not really. Then did then why did you say she was? Michael was coming to the conclusion that figuring out how her mind worked was impossible. She was a constant contradiction. She kept him on his guard, he admitted, because he never knew what she was going to say or do. Life with Isabel would never be boring. Isabel was trying to be compassionate towards Freya, the woman who had been forced to raise a difficult boy on her own and really believed that Compton would leave Glen McClenna to Clive. Freya became very angry. She called me a selfish bitch. She called me a bastard. After she left, I realized how important it was to protect the land from people like Harcus, and so I knew then that what I should do with Glen McKenna. And what is that? Michael asked. You'll find out when we get to Gladstone's office. Intrigued, he said with a smile, okay, I can wait. When they arrived at the law office, Nessie was sitting at her desk and greeted them. Mr. Gladstone will be right with you, she said. He is just finishing a phone call. As soon as they were seated in his office, Gladstone told Isabel he had been making phone calls since last night. Then then it is possible? She asked. Absolutely. She couldn't contain her excitement. James, what's up? How are you doing, my friend? How are you doing? Good to see you guys. That's my friend James Gibb Gibb. If you have not yet connected with James Gibb, go ahead and connect with him. I sincerely appreciate your support, my friend. Thank you so much for stopping by. We are reading the book Grace Under Fire, written by Julie Garwood. She couldn't contain her excitement. She turned to Michael to fill him in. Compton wouldn't let me sell Glen McKenna. He also prevented me from removing the McKenna name. I don't think this is what he had in mind, but since I can't sell it, I'm going to protect it by donating it to the National Trust for Scotland. It's a conservation organization that preserves Scotland's natural beauty. I want to make sure no one will be able to build shopping centres and amusement parks on the land. The name's going to change too. It's going to become Glen Leah McKenna. I'm not surprised at all, he said, nodding his approval. Kate and Kiera gave away the millions they inherited to build a medical center addition with your mother's name on it. And you are their sister, so I figured you would do something as generous. This is going to take some time, Gladstone warned her. A few minutes later, he repeated his concern. This won't happen overnight, Michael interpreted. He wants you to be patient. She nodded her understanding. The meeting lasted an hour, and when all the details had been discussed, Gladstone turned to Michael. Catching me, catching me up on Clive Orcus, I heard there was a fight. It wasn't much of a fight. It was more of a ruckus, Isabel said. Another Aunt Nora word. Now tell me, Michael, is it true? Gladstone asked. Did Clive Arcus strike Inspector Sinclair? And you struck Clive? The idea obviously appeals to him, judging by his wide smile. Before Michael could do more than nod, Gladstone said, Oh, I wish I had seen it. I'd run into Clive a time or two here in the offices since he was one of McCarthy's clients, and he was a nasty bit of goods. Nessie appeared in the doorway to let Gladstone know she was leaving for the day. Have a good night, my love, he called out. The two men continued their conversation, but Isabel noticed Nessie was still hovering at the door, as though there was something on her mind. Isabel got up, excused herself, and walked over to the woman. Before she could ask how she could be of help, Nessie said, May I have a word with you? Isabel followed her into the next room. Nessie was blushing when she said, I hope this isn't too presumptuous, but my friends and I heard you singing with XO, and we were wondering if we could have your autograph. We may be older, but that doesn't mean we can't appreciate good music. Isabel was so touched by the sincerity in her voice, she couldn't help but say yes. Nessie handed her a pen, and she began signing a dozen papers placed in front of her, personalizing each one with the name on Nessie's list. When she was finished, Nessie thanked her profusely. Isabel said goodbye, and as she was walking back to Gladstone's office, she almost stumbled over a couple of boxes sitting next to Nessie's desk. I'm sorry, Nessie exclaimed. I was just about to take those to my car. It's almost junk to be it's mostly junk to be donated. Nicks, knacks. Someone will want them, she said, picking up one of the boxes. I'll help, Isabel offered. Bending down, she picked up the other and walked behind Nessie to the back door, which had been propped open with a brick. I don't have a key to get back in if the door closes, Nessie explained. They loaded the boxes in the trunk of her car, and Nessie thanked Isabel again as she slid behind the wheel. Daylight was slowly fading as Isabel watched her drive away. She took a deep inhale of the clean, fresh air. She reached for the doorknob and used her foot to push the brick out of the way. But just as she was going inside, someone grabbed her arm and wrenched it back, knocking her off balance. She was so surprised, she yelled. Isabel twisted around and came face to face with Freya Arcus. The look in the woman's eyes was chilling. Isabel was so shocked to see her, she froze, but only for a second. Then she tried to get free from Freya's grip. My God, she was strong. Her hand felt like a vice grip around Isabel's arm, squeezing her to the bone. What was happening didn't make any sense to Isabel. Why had Freya launched on her arm? What did she want? And where had this superwoman's strength come from? Let go of me, Isabel demanded. She made a fist with her other hand and was about to punch Freya to get free when she saw the gun Freya had pressed into her side. Oh my God. So Freya wants to take out Isabel so that her son Clive Arcus would remain quote unquote owner to the land, Glen McKenna. If you scream or shout a warning, your man Buchanan will come running and I'll shoot him. He struck my boy, made him bleed. He shouldn't have done that. Her voice was filled with hate. He deserves to die. Oh my God. The heavy back door had already closed. Even if she could Even if she could get away from Freya, she couldn't run inside because the door had automatically locked. If she tried to run the other way, she would never make it to the street before Freya shot her in the back. And didn't have any doubt she could or would. Freya's rage was terrifying. What do you want? Isabel asked. trying to stay calm. She was in such a panic now, knowing Michael would grow impatient and would come looking for her. He wouldn't suspect Freya had a weapon, which gave her the advantage. She'd kill him before he took a step outside. You are coming with me, Freya said as she jerked Isabel ahead of her. OMG. So you see why Michael never wanted Isabel to be out of his sight. Now look at this. You give me any trouble, and I'll pound you on the door. Sober Cannon will come running. Do you understand me? Yes, yes, I understand, said Isabel. Do you want to watch him die? No, no, I'll do whatever you say. Freya shoved Isabel forward. Then move. Where are you taking me? You'll find out soon enough. Isabel's instinct was to refuse, but she couldn't do that. She was going to have to cooperate until they were far enough away from the building, and she knew Michael was safe. Then she would figure out how to get the gun away from Freya without getting shot. Freya kept her gun trained on Isabel and held tight on her wrist as they rounded the corner to the side of the building where Freya had parked her car. She shoved Isabel ahead and said, "You drive." She don't know what she just did, letting Isabel drive, knowing, well, she don't know that Isabel is a crazy driver, and Isabel will whip that car so hard Freya will fall out. She doesn't know that. But we are going to stop at that suspense right there. We're going to leave in suspense until next time. And we will read the book Grace on the Fire, written by Julie Garwood. So join me again tomorrow morning, same time, same place, for another reading. Until then, remember, Michael was between Isabel and Freya, and whether or not Michael has started to look for her. So join me again tomorrow morning sometime when we will read the book Grace on the Fire, written by Julie Garwood. So join me tomorrow morning, guys, for the reading. Until next time, my friends, this is Trev from Trev Essence, where your journey matters. Now have yourselves a fantastic day, everybody.